All right, so let's get started. Welcome everyone to this evening / this morning's staying in. I am super overexcited to say that with us we have the incredible Haben Girma, activist, writer, lawyer, all-round brilliant individual. And I think I would start off with my first question for Haben is for people that maybe haven't read your book and don't know you very well and have come along to meet you for the first time today. Could you explain how you are communicating with us today and what technology you are using?
Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. It's exciting to greet such an international group. I'm deafblind, I have limited vision and hearing, so I communicate primarily through touch. And I'm holding up a device called a Braille computer. If you know Braille technology, this is a Braille Note Apex. And on the bottom are Braille dots. I run my fingers over the dots to feel the letters. So as Amy is talking and other people talk, I have Gordon here who's typing what people are saying. He's listening into the Zoom, typing what's being said, and I'm reading it in Braille and responding back by voice. So disabled people, we're always coming up with solutions. Whatever the challenge is, we find a solution. Disability is not the barrier, at least not for me. Usually for me, the barrier is ableism. People setting up barriers, arbitrary, nonsensical barriers that don't need to be there. So after I came up with solutions for myself, I started looking at ways to come up with solutions for other people and transitioning from self-advocacy to community advocacy. And that's what I do now. And I wrote my book, Haben, the deaf-blind woman who conquered Harvard Law, to help teach people about ableism, the idea that disabled people are inferior to non-disabled people. It's a myth, it's an assumption, and it needs to be eradicated from our society. So teaching people to identify ableism and then advocate to remove it.
Great, well you'll fit in fine here, Haben, because that's the mission here at the Staying In as well, is to teach people all about disability. So, following on, my next question, we met online as two activists, and I know we frequently encounter the same issue with people on the internet who don't understand how a blind person can tweet. And if I got £1 or $1 for every single person that said, well, you can't be blind because you're tweeting, the Staying In would never have to close. So I wanted to ask, what do you think we can do as disabled people, but also what can non-disabled people do to spread awareness and understanding of accessible technology?
So non-disabled people constantly expect disabled people to teach them about disability history, culture, assistive technology. It's not our job. It's a choice to step into that role and become an instructor and ambassador. But you also have the choice to just say, Google it, look it up. I've chosen to become an ambassador and educate and teach people. In doing so, I hope to make it easier for other people to embrace and lean into other parts of their personalities and characteristics and not have to educate people about disability all the time. It should be a choice. So for Twitter and blind people, There are screen readers that read content out loud or output to a connected Braille device. And when apps are programmed to be accessible, apps like Twitter, then blind people can operate them independently, either listening in with a screen reader or reading with a screen reader and Braille display.
Fabulous. If people want to learn more about accessible technology, obviously they can read Haben's book, but we also had a session at the Staying In with Justin and Stephen, who are screen reader users and Braille display users, and they did a little demo of how they navigate the internet. So you can go and check out that video on our website. Okay, so my next question. One of my favourite things about your book was the descriptions in it. You know, from the iceberg that you slid down to all the food that you described. It was something I could experience on so much a deeper level than any other book I've read. It was so much more vivid for me. And I wondered, what would your advice be to writers about more inclusive descriptions of the world?
I do feel that most sighted writers rely so much on visual descriptions, they skip out on the other descriptions. And when we are experiencing something on a trip, climbing icebergs in Alaska, we are feeling all the different sensations that we can. And to really pull readers into that experience, you need to be able to capture all those sensations. For me, I'm deafblind. I have limited vision and hearing. So I tried to tap more into sense of touch, smell, taste. I also had visual and audio descriptions too. Disability is a spectrum. A lot of blind people are not totally blind. A lot of deaf people are not totally deaf. Same thing for deafblindness. I have some vision and hearing, and I'm able to use some of that to describe what I do experience. And when it's adventures like the iceberg, climbing the iceberg, being able to see a little bit, but not being able to see the end of the iceberg, or to see people shout, or to hear people shouting warnings, that just adds to the sense of adventure and suspense in the story.
Yeah, it was certainly one of my favourite parts of the book. I was there with you. It was amazing. So my last question, because I don't want to steal all the questions. As I sent you a message about on Twitter, Haben, I read a letter this week from the National Federation for the Blind calling on the US government not to reduce or remove civil rights granted to disabled people by the Americans with Disabilities Act under some new legislation that might take those rights away. And we're experiencing something very similar in the UK with the Coronavirus Act that is changing a lot of the laws and duties around getting care and support. A lot of disabled people right now feel that there's a real rolling back of equality and access. And I wondered, as a lawyer and as an activist, what is your advice about how we can protect our rights and fight these issues?
Call it out as ableism. Ableism is the widespread assumption that disabled lives don't matter. And often when you hear about someone passing away due to coronavirus, the first question is usually, did they have an underlying condition? Which is incredibly ableist, as if having a health condition justifies the loss of life. It doesn't. So keep calling these policies out as ableist and wrong. And if we unite across disabilities, we're stronger and more effective. There's a tendency to break into just the deaf groups, just the blind groups, but we're stronger when we unite together as the disability community demanding justice. So collaborate, work together, and keep resisting these policies.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I feel like I can start my revolution now. So now I'm going to read a couple of the questions people emailed in. And the first one is from Sasha, who is 10. And Sasha asks, is it scary not to hear or see anything? And also, what do you like to do for fun?
For fun, I love dancing. I don't really dance anymore due to the pandemic because the dancing I like is social. Swing, salsa. When I went to London back in the winter, I found a really fun place to go swing dancing. So it's just a fun way to connect with people even in different places around the world. But I'm not able to do that anymore. And is it scary to be blind and deaf? Disability in itself is not scary. Ableism is scary. The idea that there are people who believe that your life doesn't matter just because you're blind, just because you're disabled, that is scary. And it's right to feel angry about that and channel that anger toward demanding justice to get rid of ableism.
Thank you, Haben. I've got a question from Emma. As a non-disabled person, I've been slowly learning from reading your words on how to be a better non-disabled person. Still, I'm so worried about saying or doing something wrong around disabled people. I realise good-hearted love and compassion is not enough. Please could you give me some practical advice to uneducate, inexperienced people like me?
No one is ever perfect. Disabled people also accidentally do ableist things, also accidentally exclude others. So try to accept that you're never going to be perfect, so that when someone corrects you, by the way, you accidentally did something or said something that's ableist, you can bounce back from that. It's okay to make a mistake, then get back up and keep trying. There are some non-disabled people who learn one thing about being an ally and then are all excited about being an ally, and then they mess up. And after that, they're like, I'm done with disabled people. I'm not dealing with them anymore. They're too difficult. So recognize that it's a constant process to continue learning. No one is ever perfect.
Yeah, I like to think that everyone is on their own journey as well. And we have to just kind of understand that people are on a journey and guide them firmly but gently.
Exactly.
Okay, so my next question is from Mirelle. I'm a librarian at a university, and I wanted to know if you made any independent use of library resources or services during your time at Lewis and Clark and or Harvard. Or was your library use mediated through the disability service centres? If the latter, is there anything that libraries could have done to better support your learning?
You know, I'm actually still friends with librarians from my college and from law school. So I interacted with the libraries directly. The disability office was there at the first meeting to say, here's the accessible computers, here, meet the librarians, they can help answer your questions. These are the resources we have. But after that first orientation, I interacted with the librarians directly to gain access to the books, resource tools. In college, the librarian was helping me learn how to be a better researcher and find the exact books I need. So I worked directly with the librarians.
Okay, question from the chat. What was your favourite class at law school? And how can law schools do better at accommodating disabled students?
My favorite class was negotiations. And it was super fun to be able to negotiate. We would start with small things like buying a shopping mall, pretend shopping mall, and the process of negotiating that sale, being the landlord who was being the purchaser of the property or being agents for different parties. And it just gave us the opportunity to practice different negotiation skills. Disabled people, when we're asking for accommodations, when we're asserting our rights, we often have to go through these negotiations. So those skills I've taken into many different aspects of my life. And it was fun to be engaging directly with other students in that class. And the other part of the question was, how can law schools be more accessible? Law schools should increase diversity, more disabled students, hire more disabled staff, administrators, and faculty members. The more diverse the school is, the easier it'll be for disabled students to find role models and mentors within the school.
Great. So I guess that's kind of the questions that I had via email and also in the chat. Do other people have questions? You can ask or sign your question. Just kind of let us know if you would like to ask a question. I know Haben is excited to answer them. Okay, hang on. I think we got one coming in. Okay. What is the favourite strategy for getting access when there is initial resistance?
It depends on the initial resistance. Sometimes come back to that conversation from a different angle. Sometimes that works. Reframe the issue in a different way. I do know that a lot of disabled people, or I shouldn't say disabled people, I should say a lot of new negotiators come to the table with just their interests in mind, which makes sense. You want what you want. But to be a really successful negotiator, you also have to think of the interests on the other side of the table. And if you can reframe your issue, the things you want, as meeting their interests and your interests, then you're more likely to be successful. So sometimes it helps just to come back to the table, but reframe the issue so that it's a win-win for both parties. And if that doesn't work, find Find someone to help support you within that organization. Maybe the person's colleague, maybe their supervisor. Find other people within that industry who can help support you.
That question was from Natalia, who is like a massive legal expert in the UK, an activist, and has their own organisation that is called Reasonable Access. And Natalia and her colleagues ran a session recently, and it was really great about how to challenge. So that's a really interesting answer. Thank you, Haben. Okay, I'm just scrolling and looking at the next ones. Any plans for a follow-up book, or is it too soon to ask that?
It's not too soon to ask. You have the right to ask questions. You may not always get answers, but you can ask questions. Right at the moment, there isn't a second book. Maybe somewhere down the line, I'll read a second book.
Okay, next question. Why did you choose to study law? And did anyone close to you try to discourage you? Or have any awkward suggestions as an alternative?
I remember going to a blind leadership organization, and it was for college students. And we had one of the speakers talking to us about career opportunities. And the speaker told us that he worked as an attorney for many years, a blind attorney. Then he started losing his hearing and then left law because it's difficult for someone with both deafness and blindness to work in law. That was incredibly discouraging. And this actually happens in a lot of disability spaces where some disabled leaders don't fully understand ableism outside of their own disability. There's this idea that if you have an additional disability, it's the end of the world. And that's ableist, and it's hurtful to so many people who live with multiple disabilities. I had to come up with solutions for myself by talking to blind attorneys, talking to deaf attorneys. Now I know some deaf-blind attorneys, but back then when I was in college, I didn't know any. So I had to kind of figure this out on my own.
I think there's a good follow-up question to that.
And why law?
Oh, sorry.
Well, there was a lot of discrimination in college, high school, even in middle school, and I felt like I couldn't do anything about it. I was also reading stories about civil rights lawyers who fight for justice, and that inspired me to join them, to be one of those people who fight for justice. And that's what inspired me to go into law.
Okay, I've got a follow-up question to kind of the first part of that, Haben. And it's kind of a question I ask myself sometimes. How do you deal with the people in the disability community who are so critical of those who speak out online? I have found it to be exhausting to have such negativity coming from my own community. I would love to hear from yourself how you deal with it, or if you've encountered it.
For me, it hurts more to get criticism from the disability community compared to non-disabled people. I expect ableism from non-disabled people. When it comes from disabled people, it hurts so much more. And it's not just ableism, it's also sexism, it's also racism. In 2015, President Obama invited me to the White House, and I met with him and his colleagues and many disability advocates. After that event, there were deaf-blind people and deaf-blind communities online saying the only reason President Obama invited me was because I'm Black. Absolutely ridiculous, racist to say that. But racism, sexism, ableism is also in the disability community, just as it's also in the non-disabled community. My advice is to recognize that everyone, disabled and non-disabled, is on this journey of inclusion. Some people are moving forward on that journey, some are not moving forward on that journey. But if we recognize that disabled people too also have a lot of learning to do, it becomes a bit easier. And it also helps to have your strong community of supporters who can cheer you on, disabled and non-disabled.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that last part. I feel very lucky to be part of a majority community that is very supportive. Just to audio describe, when you explained the reaction to your visit with President Obama and the racism you received, my eyebrows reached the top of my head with shock and disappointment. So, following on from that, another question. Hi Haben, do you ever find it tiring asserting your rights? And if you do find it tiring, what strategies do you use to keep yourself supported as possible?
It's definitely exhausting. Advocacy fatigue is a thing. A lot of disabled people and other people who are struggling with ableism, racism, and sexism experience. It gets exhausting to constantly tell people your life matters, your access matters. And I take breaks. I make sure I give myself time to recharge. If sometimes I'm too exhausted, I let a barrier go. There's so many barriers, it's hard to tackle them all. And your health, your safety comes first. So sometimes you just need to take a break, recharge, connect with people who will energize you and cheer you on. Having a community helps, because sometimes if you're too tired to take on an issue, your community can come and help take on that issue and remove that barrier.
I would definitely agree with sort of reaching out to people and getting that shared support could be really valuable. And I find that I've learned a huge amount from other communities about how they do self-care during their activism and how they deal with that kind of the violence that you might experience and harassment. And I've found that really useful to engage in other communities that do that. A question from Justin. While going through law school, how useful was it to have online research tools at your fingertips? I'm blind and studied for a paralegal degree at an online college, and we used Westlaw extensively in our classes.
Oh, online research tools were incredibly important. I can't really read print books directly. I need to be able to access them digitally. So having research tools that allowed me to quickly search through cases, books, laws, that helped me, that increased the amount of work I could quickly do.
Okay, somebody is sharing up that they were upset when they found out that a big publisher like Times did not include captions on the Times 100 talks. Then when you appealed, they only fixed it on your talk, not all of them. How can we legalise mandating captions for all major organisations?
I'm glad someone else noticed. Sometimes it's exhausting to always be the one complaining about these things. It makes a huge difference that other people notice and stand up. And it shouldn't always just be deaf people. We also want hearing people to say, you should have captions. This needs captions. And not just the disabled person's talk, but all the talks should have captions. Time should know better. If more people could write to Time and say, caption all these talks. These need to be captioned so deaf people have access. And it actually makes it easier for hearing people to access the content too when it has captions.
Yeah, absolutely. This was a point that a lot of us were making recently in the UK around government communications, and our government is increasingly relying on social media to communicate really important stuff, like whether a local area is going into lockdown or new rules about face masks. And the communications keep being inaccessible. And what is really helpful for, I am not a person that needs captions, but I always advocate for it because I know that people do. And that's what we all need to do. We all need to say, this should have captions. This should have an image description. This should be available in an easy read format or a plain English format. We should all be advocating for that.
Yes, exactly. And the more people who step up and demand access, the more likely we're going to get it.
Hear, hear. Next question. Do you have any advice for a disabled person trying to become a solicitor? It's been made clear by different law firms that it's not ideal to hire disabled people. I don't know anyone with my condition, cystic fibrosis, among others, who is a solicitor.
I'm not an expert when it comes to British law. But I will say that discrimination is illegal in the United States, and you cannot deny access. You can't discriminate against job applicants on the basis of disability in the US. And I would hope that's the case in the UK as well.
Yeah, under the Equality Act, you're not supposed to be able to discriminate on the basis of disability. But as we all know, it happens anyway. And I would say to the person who asked this question, I reckon Natalia is your friend on this one. And I have some good tips around that. Next question from Helen. Here in the UK, if you're deaf-blind and you use a white cane or a guide dog, they have red and white stripes on the cane or the guide dog's harness to signify that the person is deaf-blind. Does the USA have anything similar?
If we do, it's not widely used. I've heard of that second stripe for deaf blindness, but don't really know anyone who uses that. I've never had, and none of my instructors have ever told me to do that.
Yeah, because in the UK...
Also, it needs to be a choice. You can't force disabled people to go out in public identifying themselves as disabled. Some people do not want the extra risk of of being targeted for harassment and discrimination. Others are comfortable being open about their disabilities. So it really should be a choice.
Yeah, in the UK,
Is it optional in the UK for deaf-blind people to publicly identify themselves that way?
yeah, it's optional. In the UK, our white canes are all white. They don't have the red section that they tend to have in the States. And I understand the red section at the end of the cane is to do with snow, and being able to see the cane against snow. We don't have that. Our canes are just totally white. So if there is any red stripe on it, yes, that means the person is identifying as deaf-blind. But whether the public knows that, I mean, I don't think many members of the public do understand what the red and white stripes mean. My friends who are deafblind don't, they say that people don't really get it, but I'd be interested to hear what other people, their experiences are on that.
I also want to clarify, in the United States, there are all kinds of canes. I have a cane here. My backup cane, when I'm not working with my guide dog, is an all white cane. And I have a friend who has a rainbow cane. So there are canes here in the United States that don't have the red strip, but then there are also plenty of those as well.
Yeah, I always understood, and Justin, who's joining us today, explained this to me, that actually there are certain laws around drivers and them having to understand what the cane is in the States. We don't have those laws here. I have a pink cane that I use when I'm going to parties, and Justin actually ordered that for me. So yeah, people do use different coloured canes here, but yeah, I think it's different. There aren't really any like laws around it. You can kind of use what you want.
Yes, you are taking a risk if you are changing the colors of your canes, but for some people, it's worth it. The fun and joy of having a rainbow cane.
Yeah, I need to get more colours so I can coordinate them with my outfit, Haben.
Go for it. Maybe you could have some way to add on and remove maybe fabrics that could go on and off the cane.
Well, I use cane accessories. So I use like key rings or little toys or charms, and I clip them onto the elastic. And at the moment, I have a unicorn on my cane.
Fun.
Yeah, super fun. Okay, next question. With corporates and politicians using COVID to push ableist policy and eugenics ideology, how can we encourage more disabled people to embrace both activism and assisted tech when so many are fearful?
The fear of activism and assistive tech is not unique to disabled people. There are lots of non-disabled people who are scared of activism and scared of tech. And education helps. Having friends who could show that assistive tech tools are not scary, and showing examples of activism. Part of the fear of activism is you are putting yourself at risk when you practice activism. Risk of retaliation, risk of isolation, and in some cases, risk of police violence. So there are risks involved with activism. It takes courage to demand justice, to resist the barriers. And I hope more people will tap into that courage to resist ableism and racism and sexism.
Okay, next question. What was it like to win the scribed case? And what do you hope the lasting impacts of that win are, or what have they been?
When I finished law school, I worked at a law firm that took on a case against a digital publisher and library where blind people couldn't read the books on the digital library. And we sued them in court, and the court agreed with us that the library was subject to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And after that, the publisher, called Script, agreed to make their books accessible to blind readers. That sent a message to the tech community: the ADA matters. It was the second case in the United States to hold that the Americans with Disabilities Act applies to online businesses. And it was incredibly rewarding to be able to set legal precedent like that. And I hope more tech companies pay attention and make their services accessible. There are a lot who are not paying attention, and they're putting themselves at risk of litigation.
Following on from that question, someone would like to know, how quickly can you read Braille text in a words per minute kind of a way?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't tested myself recently. I'm not the fastest Braille reader. I'm faster than most Braille readers. But I also have lots of friends who are huge Braille fans, and some of them read faster than me. So I encourage every blind person to take the time to learn Braille. Speech is amazing. Speech to technology, speech to text technology, screen readers, that's incredibly useful. But it's also important to be able to touch words and read words directly.
Okay, there's a two-part question here. Hi Haben, I don't know if this is covered in your book, but I'd love to hear about what it was like for you growing up as a disabled person in terms of how you felt about your disability. I grew up being ashamed and embarrassed to be disabled and would have loved a disabled adult in my life to help me understand and embrace my disability. And then the second question, did you have anyone disabled to look up to?
That is in my book. I strongly encourage you to read my book. There's a chapter where I talk about going to a camp for the blind, where I met counselors who were blind, dance instructors who are blind, fellow campers and friends who are blind. It helps to be able to spend time in disability spaces and build up friendships and mentorships. Then when you go back to spaces where maybe you're the only disabled person, you have that community you can fall back on to cheer you on and get you through the rest of the year.
Well, we hope that's what the staying in is going to be for a lot of people. You know, we're here as a community. We're going through this shared experience. We're all learning together. And it's really important to have online spaces at this time where, you know, the real world isn't as accessible even as it normally is.
Yeah, this is the kind of space that creates disability community. There's also Crib Camp, which is a documentary that came out this year. And throughout the summer, they're holding free sessions every Sunday afternoon American time, for people to come together and meet disability activists.
Yeah, we watched Crip Camp together at the Staying In. We had a Netflix party and everyone really enjoyed it. It's a great movie. I loved it.
Excellent film.
Okay, next question. Many people say litigation is too aggressive. How do you feel about accusations that litigating is aggressive and unreasonable, and that if you litigate, you haven't tried hard enough with other strategies?
So, litigation is a tool to fight discrimination. I treat it as the last resort. First, I try being friendly. Sometimes that works. Actually, that works a lot of the time. If that doesn't work, then I try collaborating with colleagues, talking to their colleagues, their supervisors, framing the issue as a civil rights issue. And usually that works. But occasionally that doesn't work, and then you need to switch to litigation. Because for some stubborn, difficult institutions, that's the only way they'll change.
Okay, do you have any plans to go back to litigation, or do you feel your current form of advocacy work is your path forward?
There's a time and place for litigation, but what I'm doing right now, I feel, is more impactful, and that I'm reaching more people now than I did back when I was at the law firm.
Okay. I'm just looking at other questions and comments. Natalia says, I have a 4-stage process. Ask nicely is number 1. Number 2 is explain or ask in a different way. 3, tell them I'm going to complain. And then 4 is complain or litigate. Which I think is quite a good guide for a step through of the process.
Thanks for sharing that.
Okay, well, we're drawing towards the end of our time. I'm just going to have to check if anyone else has any questions. You can ask a question in person using your voice or signing if you would like. Just let us know. You can say hi in the chat and you can unmute yourself. So I'll just give people a second in case anyone does want to do that. Well, I think it's possible we may have exhausted all of the questions that exist in the world for Haben.
Well, how's your gin and tonic?
Oh, I finished it already.
You're fast. Will you have another one?
Of course I will.
Well, thank you for bringing us all together at the Staying In, and it was fun to do an international British pub.
Yeah. Well, have you had your fish and chips?
I did have fish and chips. It was incredibly delicious. It was tricky to find a place that did it around here, but online research helped.
Good work. The final point is, do you have any questions for us, Haben? Do you have any questions about the staying in or our community or anything you're curious about?
Not at the moment.
Well, thank you so much for coming. This was amazing. I'm sure everyone really enjoyed asking you questions. Thank you for answering so many questions.
You're very welcome. Thanks for hosting this, Amy.
And I would just remind everyone that we are still fundraising, and if you enjoyed the session today, please do consider donating to our fundraiser. We have a GoFundMe and we have a PayPal pool, and the details are in the email that you got the details of this event. So I think we're just going to do a great big thank you to Haben, and we're going to do our British Sign Language thank you, which is our 2 palms up by our chin and then coming out. Thank you. And we're going to say thank you to Haben. And then we're going to say thank you to Gabby and Gary, our interpreters. And we're finally going to say thank you to Sam for our wonderful captions today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Haben.
There's lots of thank yous in the chat.